first of all, I love that your example showed that context and framing is everything. How in one culture, in the US culture, the certain terms that have kind of a racial slur connotation exist with that negative connotation because of the historical pattern of how they have been used and how the meaning we assign to a word can completely change our kind of visceral reaction and response to it. Um, I'm also kind of thinking about how certain cultures who have encountered, let's say, a term that is seen as derogatory or that has been used in a deliberately derogatory way. I mean, sometimes people are literally using slurs to try and demean and degrade and dehumanize people. But some communities say, hey, we're going to reclaim this term or like reappropriate this term. And I think that's a great example of how the framing and the context around a term can really change our kind of experiences of it, depending on how it's used, who's using it, and what we make of the word when we hear it. So, for example, it's kind of interesting. The word queer, which is of course relevant for our conversation, up until the 80s and early 90s, the term queer was predominantly only used as a slur and in an attempt to insult people or kind of describe their behavior in a derogatory way or describe their experiences or sexuality in a derogatory way. But, things started to change in the 80s, 90s, and of course, much more now. I mean, the term queer is now seen as a positive term that is reclaimed by a lot of people to describe their experience either with gender nonconformity or sexuality. I mean, it can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, right? But that's a really good example of how in one moment in time, a term is really can be felt like very an affront. And then depending on how it's used at a later point, people self-define as queer and they say like, oh, my cousin's queer or my friend is queer. And that's not seen as an insult.